You are listening to MSP 1337, a podcast dedicated to helping MSPs and their clients navigate cybersecurity. Security maturity is a journey, but that doesn't mean you have to travel alone. I'm your host, Chris Johnson, and I want to personally thank you for joining us today. Before we jump into the show, I would like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, MSP-Ignite. MSP-Ignite offers a peer group experience that is unique to managed service providers in the technology industry. If you are serious about implementing a model for success through sharing and collaboration of best practices, this is the best way to do it. Head on over to msp-ignite.com today to find out more. Now on with the show. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of MSP 1337. Today, we are talking a little bit about co-managed IT and a lot about educating the unwilling. I've got Eric Hanson of Inland Productivity with us today, and I've got Bob Coppedge with co-managed IT. Thanks, guys.
Yay.
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 As we started last episode, or maybe it was 2 episodes ago, we got into this whole conversation about it is my pleasure. And I had to do a clarification, like this is a reference to a movie. This is not some sort of like inside conversations. So anyways, I appreciate how we started this one. It feels very superficial and platonic and very comfortable. So I'm good. So as we jump into this, we've had conversations over the last, 10 episodes where our conversation has revolved around helping MSPs be successful. And one of the things that's becoming I think a big opportunity for MSPs as a whole is what does co-managed IT look like? And specifically, what does it look like when you're dealing with an internal IT department and you have an opportunity to bring them a product or service that they otherwise are not able to do on their own? So Eric, our background is that you and I were once upon a time that relationship where I was the client as the internal IT, if you will. And then you guys were the outsourced MSP who did basically 90% of what I was supposed to do because I was not an IT guy at the time. And I primarily was there for the web application side. So if you think about how much internal IT was being done, it was about 10% to the 90% that you guys handled. So talk to me, this has been now 15 years. Talk to me about your experience with co-managed IT and how we sort of segue into where I think Bob and I and the three of us will talk about what it means to get into educating the unwilling.
All right. Well, we fortunately we still retain that client. They're a great client today, and that deal in a lot of ways has gone the way that MSPs were always taught to do things. Go in and eliminate the internal IT, and we were kind of a weird deal because the customer recognized that, hey, I need somebody inside to do this stuff around our line of business software that we were never going to get good at. And we were there before you came in, and then we were still after you. But through that, I think we sort of learned how co-managed works long before co-managed was a thing. And we definitely, you and I certainly had our struggles at times figuring out, okay, whose problem is this, that, or the other thing. But, in the long run, it definitely worked out. And I think it worked out well for the client.
Well, I think that was an interesting one because and having been on the internal side, how many meetings I was in where, my employer is saying, Chris, why aren't you doing those things? Or why do we still need this outsourced MSP? And many times it was really interesting to just be able to answer with, I've never learned those things. I'm one person in the case of the company that I was with. So for me to say I'm going to be an expert on your network or an expert on your firewalls, I might be able to do a couple of those things, but that's 2 items on a list that we don't have time on this episode to walk through, right? So, and then the conversations, Eric, that you and I would have sitting down with management or the owners, and they're looking at a quote for $50,000, and they're like, Chris, well, what do you think about this? I'm like, well, what's the alternative option? That I do it, so it saved you $4,000, and you don't know if it got done right.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and we've now expanded to be doing more of those, and we have a relatively large sort of adjacent industry to that one that they have a couple internal people, and they call us when it hits the fan, and hopefully we try to keep that stuff under control. But there's stuff they don't want to hear, and won't say yes to. That's like, do you realize what a risk you have to this business? And this is a organization that got had a major crypto event. I mean, the entire network was taken down. It was a 4-day recovery. It was ugly.
And this gets into that, for lack of a better phrase, educating the unwilling. And yet, even when they're educated, they're still saying it's you can lead the horse to water, but you can't make them drink. Sometimes
I remember that Saturday morning phone call, because it was like, that thing you came and talked to us about on Thursday that might happen. We think it happened.
Somewhere between Thursday and today, which is usually how it happens, right? When the bad thing happens, it's not immediately because you shared it with them. It's got to be just long enough, even if it's just the next day, for them to recognize that you did tell them about this, which raises the question, how many times do they go, I bet they did this?
I guarantee that was going through their mind.
Right? So I have one more question before we kind of segue into that, educate the unwilling. I think about my sort of career path, and after getting out of the MSP space, I started working in more cybersecurity focused environments where, for lack of a better word, it was co-managed IT, and I would get the phone calls to talk about the deep dive on, hey, looking at the threat intelligence, how are we patching our machines? Are we doing a good job? Kind of like an accountability assessment, if you will. And so as I was working with some of these larger entities, what I found happening is that I'm talking to someone that's in the middle, right? They're not a key decision maker. They're authority or influencing, purchasing decisions, but they're not necessarily getting the entire buy-in from the top down. And I always found I hated it when I had to have those conversations, and I'm kind of like a wedge trying to get through that and then work my way up. Do you run into that, or do you have a way to say maybe address that or work around that?
It's certainly a moving target. What do you think, Bob?
One of the things I often say to folks is the worst time to learn CPR is when someone's having a heart attack. It's one of those where, and this is true both from the IT professional standpoint, as individuals, and also the MSP, is we tend to only explain stuff when it needs to be understood. And, right. And by holding off on those things, and sometimes it's because the client doesn't want to hear it, sure, or the internal IT person doesn't want to hear it, or we don't want to be bothered, whatever. Everybody's got to agree to play. If you're waiting until that time where decisions have to be made, it's too late, because everyone's already making decisions based on only that moment in time, whatever their preconceived notions are. And so if they're looking at this as, oh, here comes the vendor, they're just going to ask us for more money. Or the internal IT person talks to management, oh, this guy or gal is a whiner, always wants more, is always complaining about the work. Or I just saw this on CNN. I am so sick of seeing this stuff in the news. They're obviously just going for whatever. Mm-hmm. It's one of those where you have to constantly be engaging in a low method, just quiet noise, almost noise in the background, so that because they'll hear some of it and it accumulates. And it's one of those where if you can basically talk about risk when the risk isn't there, when the issue isn't right there in their face, but talk about it then, and then a couple weeks later when it happens, you can go, you remember that thing we talked about a couple weeks, kind of like Eric, to your point. You remember how we were hoping this day would never happen? Well, it's here. Well, think about how bad that would have been if you had to explain that day happening at the same time it's happening.
Right. Well, this kind of gets into that whole risk appetite, risk tolerance, all of those pieces that I think by and large, as MSPs, that's a difficult conversation to have in the prospecting phase, or even in the, we'll say the honeymoon phase, where I'm suddenly taking things off your plate, making your life easier. And I think sometimes that whole thing gets overlooked because then, to your point, it already happened and now we're talking about it. What if we could have avoided some of this?
Well, and that's where you get into the whole concept of what is risk.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, risk by some of the classic, inherent risks, impact. What's the impact if this occurs?
Mm-hmm.
What is the impact of the occurrence? And then what's the probability that it will occur?
Right.
And that's kind of like, that's your vulnerability at that point. And it's one of those where, and it's a great, oh my God, if you can do a tabletop discussion with the CEO, the internal IT or whatever, where you just simply go back and go, what if? How bad would you rank that 1 to 100? And then whether they give it or you give it, here's the probability we see this of happening, so on and so forth. And you do that at a time where there is nothing bad happening.
Which we may never get back to that space, that world, right? But at least it's not necessarily happening to them right now. And if you can live in that vortex just long enough to have those conversations. And I think, and I want to throw this out there because, we were talking about before we started this recording was that, the difference between me and them, right? So I'm the MSP and they're the client and no one really cares about me. It should be all about the client and their security, not necessarily mine. And I think what's problematic right now with even when I was an MSP is being afraid to go in and have a conversation about risk, because in a lot of cases, we don't know the business model or what their client is doing for their clients. So now it's like, how do I help them build a risk, metric to quantify or qualify those risks? And it's at the end of the day, it's probably not my job to do that, but I at least need to get in front of them to say, have you done this before?
It is absolutely okay. If you want to look at your MSP as being a commodity,
sure,
you're based on price only, you're just there to make the lights blink, all of that
right.
kind of fun stuff, and at your job.
Right.
Because every time somebody comes up with a new way to automate this stuff, your life as an MSP just got cheaper. So you've got to constantly find ways to engage and to add value to your client or your customer. I don't care who you are, what you're doing, all that. That has to, because that's, everybody always asks that question, what keeps you up at night? That's the one thing, is commoditization. That's the one thing that scares the bejeebers out of me. So I am constantly looking and say, how can I add value?
And that's happening. I mean, we've got telco vendors, at least in our space, that are out there banging on every potential customer for that very thing.
It's been happening since the first transistor got installed.
Well, and it's not necessarily bad. I think that's one of the areas that we've been challenged with is what our culture right now, though, is saying you should become, say, an MSSP, because in the security space where it's not yet really commoditized as far as, speeds and feeds. And we forget that I hope that in that space, it becomes really, really commoditized compared to where it is today, because I can't have, say, 2 or 3 engineers, FTE, staring at event logs all day. I need to have it just notify me when there's something bad to look at so that I'm not spending the money on those 3 FTEs. And my value is how I respond with that information to take care of the client needs, right? I think that's what we have got to get out of, is that the commoditization is necessarily bad. It's that remembering that if we're not providing the value client facing, then we in and of ourselves are the commodity.
It's the commoditization is not bad as long as you're raising the value of your MSP to keep ahead of it.
Yes.
If you are not, then it is horrible and it is the death of your organization.
So now that we're really already talking about, educating the unwilling or the uninformed who doesn't want to be informed, we talked about this before we got on the call about how by and large, it's about miscommunication, either from us to the SMB or vice versa, as far as what the expectations are out of the gate. So I think as we go into sort of the last part of this podcast is just talk to me about when you say well, I wrote it down. When you say miscommunication, what do you think is the big missing piece that, we kind of don't line up?
I think the biggest piece is involvement and engagement of management. Is right now, and whenever we talk about cybersecurity, there's the word cyber. It's a computer thing. That's what I pay you for. Done.
Right. Yeah, I'm out.
Yeah, I'm out. And,
exactly. You have that all covered.
Right.
I shouldn't need to think about that.
It's like saying managed firewall, right? We go back in the day, go back 10 years. What MSP didn't sell a managed firewall or call it a managed firewall?
Well, or we sold firewalls and we didn't manage them.
And we didn't. Exactly. We installed it and ran the other way.
100% agree with that. But I mean, how many times did we say that we're going to sell you a firewall, and then there was the miscommunication because the client is assuming that because you put it in, that you are also managing the firewall.
But here's part of the challenge, and there's two different versions of this, and they're colliding with each other. Number one is, if you go back 10 years ago, the bad guys were not making a lot of money. Okay. The bad guys were essentially, a lot of them were just malicious. They were jerks. The stereotype of the disaffected genius programmer hacker living in mom's basement.
Sure.
Had some truth to it. So you could have one bad actor who just wrote viruses, or who hacked into systems and did that, blah, blah, blah.
And did it for the giggles and grins of it.
Absolutely. Or
and shared that with us, right? We all wished we were that hacker, right? There was some sort of nostalgia around, even like think back to the movie Hackers. It's like, when you think about that movie, it was all about the glamorization of being a hacker and then getting the girl.
Well, and also they targeted specific companies based on their size and all that. Now, flash forward to 2015-16, now we get the ransomware. Both in terms of the product itself, the delivery mechanism, and the efficiency of delivering it over very, very large scales. Now suddenly we're making money. Now suddenly, and by we I mean me and Russian bad guys.
Right. I get the we.
So now we're talking about generating revenue. Now it's an entrepreneurial model. Yeah, so that we now, over the last 5 years or so, we now have people who are willing to invest a ton of money, a ton of time, hire the best people, not only on the technical side, but also on the marketing side, the social engineering side, all of that kind of fun stuff. And they are making, and I can't remember the but I think it's somewhere in the $5 to $8 billion market. And that's revenue, not dollars or not costs. And that's something that we don't communicate we don't communicate effectively enough to management. The fact
that the costs are small.
Well, not only, but the bad guys are coming up with every new way they can come up with every single day, because that CEOs understand. They may not understand firewalls, but they understand incentivized entrepreneurs. So that's one thing that we do a poor job of explaining, to understand that's important. The second thing we do is we let them abdicate. We let them, because we're trying to sell our services. And if part of our service sales pitch is, and by the way, you have to be more involved than you ever have been before on IT.
Yeah.
That's not what they wanted to hear.
Right.
But we have to communicate. We have to engage them and say, because otherwise we can't protect you.
And I think there's a part 3 to this, because I was thinking about what you said. So 10, 15 years ago, it was the act of doing it, and it was glamorized. Then it was, this is a profitable, this is a business venture. I'm entrepreneurial and I'm making money, whether I'm skimming credit cards, you name it, they're all different kinds of models for it. But now you fast forward. And so even in a shorter period of time, we've flipped that even again. Now our clients are going, yeah, but you can recover from my backups, or you can get my data back. Well, data back is more of, you can get back to your data. But now who has your data? Because those are the effects that I think that, like even the recent Orion thing is, it's not a question of what they could do to the system that they were on, right? It's what did they see while they were on that system? And so it's like, you may never know what that was. And so our opportunities right now as we go forward is to, like you said, force the unwilling participation about IT to say, you have to participate, because this is more than about what's been encrypted. It's more than about what's been broken. It's about who has it.
Yeah. And what are they going to do with it? As we move into this environment where, okay, I'm going to great. You can recover from it. We figured out, you guys have figured out how to recover from it. Well, I'm going to spend a bunch of time exfiltrating this, and I'm going to charge you to promise not to hand it out.
Right. And so I have, as we wrap this up, I got one question. It's the same question for both of you. If I look at how I go about running my business, the number one thing that they still say is, well, until it happens to me, right? That's still the conversation we end up having. And so if you think of something in the moment, what is the one thing that you would say to the SMB that says, well, it hasn't happened to me, or it's not bad enough? How to have that one little conversation piece that I think every MSP is probably, if they've made it this far into the podcast, this is the one piece maybe that will help them. It's the Easter egg to help them when they're talking to that SMB to say, look, if you have the conversation, this is what I would say. So I'll go with you first, Eric.
I really go through education with, real world stories. We have had to respond to, unfortunately, a couple of, what we term as customers. Those means people who are not, on the full program, if you will.
Not clients.
Right. Clients do what we tell them to do, and they generally don't push back that hard. But that's because we've had that opportunity to do the education. But customers who use us, either break fix here and there. I just had a conversation with somebody the other week, and I was unsuccessful at communicating how important or what the probability of them having somebody do something dumb and get everything broken.
Yes. So to paraphrase that, you can't lead. It's the lead the horse to water, can't make them drink. So the question to you is, how much time do you invest in that opportunity, like to just move on to the one that you've got the relationship with and can continue protecting that business?
Well, unfortunately, I have ethics, so I will try my hardest to really make sure that they understand it. And if they don't get it the first time, I will be back for another swipe at it and another swipe at it and another swipe at it, because at some point I'm going to have an example that it becomes meaningful to them. Unfortunately, and hopefully that example isn't them.
And it's CYA, right? If you're having this repeated conversation, I think CYA is coming into the picture. So any MSP
that's
listening,
that's where the denial of service letter comes. It's like, okay, we have talked to you about this. Please sign here. So if it happens to you, my butt's covered.
Right. All right, Bob. What's the one piece that you would go with?
I basically would pull out from a perspective, first of all, and I don't try to sell security. I try to discuss risk.
Right.
I like that. Why the risk is there, why it's meaningful, why the bad actors can do, will, whatever.
And do they know the risk?
Exactly. So from that aspect of it. Now, what do we get as a follow-up to that? Do we get the follow-up, to use your example? Well, it hasn't happened to me. If someone truly is giving me that answer, there's something else going on.
Yep.
Okay. I haven't made the connection. I haven't engaged properly. They just don't want to tell me what the real issue is, which is fine. And to Eric's point, absolutely, you have to be willing to walk. And whether it be walk away or sign this paper, which basically means I'm not responsible for half of the stuff that I want to do to help you.
Right.
Because you won't let me do it right.
Yeah.
And so it's one of those where you could almost make the point of, now, do you have other MSPs who are promising to keep you secure?
Mm-hmm.
Because I would love to see how they're doing it, or how they're, because that's fantastic if they've come up. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So turn it a little bit, the conversation, not into a, oh, you freaking moron, you don't realize how bad you don't want to turn into that adversarial thing.
But that's what a lot of MSPs do. well, you're an idiot. So
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
And sadly, they don't use those words, but it's definitely felt by the SMB, right? They're feeling the "you don't care" model happening right there in that meeting, and they're already shopping for someone that's at least gives them more lip service.
And I think one of the things, and I've had this conversation with clients to basically where I will say something along the lines of, if you don't follow this strategy, I cannot support you.
Right.
I cannot, in good faith, good conscience, like Eric's saying, being an ethical person, rounding up, where we're basically saying, I can't pay lip service to this.
Right. All right, guys. As we close out, where can those listeners find you guys at online?
Eric, you want to?
Oh, I'm just inland-prod.com. And
that's where you are.
That's where I am.
That's
where I am. I mean, LinkedIn and
yep.
all the usual suspects.
All the usual suspects. All right. And Bob?
If you want to see a lot of the tools that we use for communicating with both existing and potential clients, connect with me on LinkedIn. I post a video every business day, a couple minutes long. Some are weirder than others. If you want to learn more about the co-managed IT world, then we've got a Facebook group, CoMITS, just co-managed IT services. Check that out. We got about 1,200 MSPs. And then I've got a website, CoMITS4MSPs.com, which has coaching for MSPs interested in getting into the co-managed world.
Well, guys, I really appreciate it. This has been a great conversation. Off the cuff, MSP 1337. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Bye.